Welcome to week 4, everyone. You've made it this far. Congratulations, especially after a challenging week, I think, with that dense passage of 3:21 to 31. Let me just express my gratitude for the generosity of your engagement with the material, including my podcast expositions. I know those are presenting for many of us some novel interpretations that have all kinds of theological and practical implications. And I just appreciate your willingness to entertain what I'm proposing and to try to follow the sort of interpretation that I am developing through the letter, even as that presents a whole variety of challenges to some of our standard ways of making sense of the language we find in Romans. There have been some really great conversations this past week, I think, really trying to probe what Paul is saying about faith, how it is that the work of Christ justifies the human, and especially how all of that is presented as having a concrete effect and therefore purpose in what Paul is arguing, and that is to exclude boasting, to rule it out by a law of faith, as Paul says. And that has helped us, I think, to perhaps make more explicit and clear the driving purpose that Paul has for writing, so that it's not simply about kind of defining individual human being status before God or something along those lines, without attention to specific dynamics of human beings in relationship with one another, both as groups and as persons, that Paul's teaching in Romans is meant to address. So I appreciate you just kind of pressing into that, trying to track with the argument, even though that has been dizzying for some of us, I think, especially this last week. This next week in Romans 4 and the beginning of chapter 5, I think you'll find that Paul's teaching is perhaps not quite so dense. I don't think so, at least, but of course still has its fair share of challenges. Now, building on what Paul has argued to this point, we're kind of coming to what many readers of Romans have identified as a kind of conclusion to the first part of the letter at the end of chapter 4, where Paul is going to switch from this language of justification to talking in other kinds of language. And in chapter 4, just to preview a little bit, the subject, which is a quite natural transition, I think, from what Paul has just said about establishing the law by teaching that justification is by faith alone rather than by works of the law, is a treatment of our relation to Abraham. How have we found Abraham to be our father? How do we find ourselves, Paul asks his most immediate readers as well as us, participating in this intergenerational family of promise. And as you'll hear me argue in the podcast for this week, Abraham is not some random example that Paul has happened upon. Abraham is a seminal figure in whom, in a sense, the whole promise of the future for the people of God and finally for the whole world is kind of planted by God. So the question is not so much about Abraham as an individual as it is about Abraham as a father, as an ancestor. And it's not so much about a system of transactions of some kind that took place between God and Abraham and therefore might be the same for us. Instead, it is about the dynamics of inheritance, how it is that the promise and its fulfillment come to this sprawling intergenerational family across time? What makes it tick? How does it work? So I hope that you'll be able to kind of frame what Paul is teaching about Abraham and Abraham's promised family in those terms, rather than kind of losing sight of the intergenerational character of this family, and therefore the nature of Abraham, not just as an exemplar or something, but as an ancestor from whom subsequent generations of the people of God are inheriting what God has promised. And that, I think, is what justification is about. It is about enjoying the inheritance that God promised to Abraham and his future, which is the subsequent generations of his family, the principal figure of which, of course, is Jesus himself. So that's what's coming in chapter 4. And then in chapter 5, there's a really kind of stunning development in some ways, because Paul suddenly starts advocating boasting. And we have been studying carefully how it is that Paul has set out to exclude boasting, to show how it is ruled out by the way that the justice of God has been revealed, especially finally in the person of Jesus and in the faith of Jesus. And here now suddenly Paul is going to turn and advocate for boasting, but of course, in a very subversive way. He's going to turn boasting on its head and show how we can boast in an anti-boasting kind of way. That might sound just convoluted, but it's actually typical of the way that Paul uses language, uses key terms, almost poetically, to create new possibilities of meaning and to help us deal with what is sometimes a problematic legacy or set of temptations, not by fleeing to some new safe space that's far away from that language or all of those practices, but instead a way of engaging the language of the legacies in which we find ourselves, even if that is to do so critically and to challenge what basic terms and practices are about, what they mean. And so that's what Paul is up to with advocating an anti-boasting kind of boasting, even as he advocated for a law of faith that rules out justification by works of the law. So you can see that same kind of dynamic there. And I hope that this is showing you how dynamic Paul's use of language is in Romans and, of course, in other letters of his. His argument, his storytelling is it's got all kinds of drama going on in it, all kinds of purposeful, poetic-like usage of words. And the tendency in the way that we have read Paul, as I've said before, is often to kind of flatten all of that out into something that comes across as doctrinaire and maybe even puritanical or sterile in terms of its abstract kind of language. But in fact, when we read it carefully, I think we find that Paul is performing something with the words that he writes. And the rich dynamics to that, while they can be confusing, show us that Paul is not simply trying to rehearse a code. He is performing something with language. And part of the purpose of that is to form us by what he has written with that language, so that we can learn the dynamics of the language of the faith rather than simply regurgitate what will effectively be a dead code. And this is where I hope that you'll find that our class is not about giving you some new snappy lingo to use to articulate the faith or make sense of life, but instead a sort of discipline, a formation by this argument of Paul's, whose effect is to enrich our own vernacular, Yes, it might add words here and there, but it's hopefully not about adding a bunch of words, and especially technical words that are not familiar ways of talking, but instead a way of enriching our speech by exposing perhaps some of the inconsistencies or incoherencies or theologically flawed ways that we have of talking or making sense of our life or even living, and encouraging us with this word to grow into the truth of the gospel as Paul has expressed it. So that's what's coming in terms of content this week. We've got some good things to think about in terms of the text itself and beyond.